Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week we're exploring a healing story from John's Gospel, which landed Jesus in hot water with the Jerusalem temple authorities. Before we dive into that account, however, if you've not done so already, you may find it useful to download the sheet accompanying this study, and you'll find the link for that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado then, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from John's Gospel, chapter 5, verses 1 to 9. This passage details the second time that we're told in John's Gospel that Jesus had headed up to Jerusalem for a religious festival. On the first occasion that we heard about in chapter 2, verses 13 through to 22, Jesus overturned the tables of the moneylenders and the traders in the temple courtyard, and as verses 23 to 25 of that chapter show, attracted the hostility of the religious authorities even at that very early stage of his public ministry. Following that incident and his famous encounter with Nicodemus, Jesus had been making his way back from Judea to Galilee. And immediately prior to today's passage, we're told about Jesus encountering a royal official based in Cana of Galilee, whose son, who was over in Capernaum, was seriously ill. Jesus healed this man's son at a distance, and thus he performed the second of the signs following his return to Galilee from that Judean visit. Signs and wonders are a big part of John's Gospel. The first one was the wedding at Cana in chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. And then this second one I just detailed was in chapter 4, verses 46 to 54. Jesus, having spent this time in Galilee, performed this second sign, as I say, now returned to Judea. And the action takes place, as we learn in verse 2 of today's reading, near the Sheep's Gate to Jerusalem. So this was the gate that people would use to bring their sheep and other livestock into the city. So as you can imagine, it was somewhat out of the way. And we're told that there was a pool there called Bethsaida in the Hebrew, and it had 5 porticos around it, and people who were sick would gather in those porticos waiting for healing. We're also told, as well as the geographical location, something about the timing of these events, in that verse 9 tells us it was the Sabbath day. And that will explain the hostility that we see towards the man who'd been healed. If we read on a little bit into chapter 5, verse 10, he was not meant to be carrying his mat on the Sabbath day, and that's why the religious authorities stopped him. So the time setting is also important here. So in this text, we very obviously have Jesus in the early days of his public ministry, and as I've already hinted, getting hostile reactions from religious authority figures in Jerusalem and beyond. He was the subject of controversy and grumblings. In the background, we have the disciples who were with Jesus, though they're not explicitly mentioned in this part of John chapter 5. And we have an unnamed man who we're told in verse 5 had been sitting in one of the porticos as someone who was waiting for healing, and he'd been ill for 38 long years. So it was quite possibly the largest portion of his adult life where he'd been unable to find healing and wholeness. Now we know that John's Gospel was the final of the 4 Gospels to be written, around 90 to 95 of the Common Era. And it often contains a degree of theological reflection on who Jesus is that we don't necessarily find in the synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew and Luke. And John also contains a certain amount of material that's unique to that Gospel, and that's true of the healing story that we find today. Having said that, there is a story that has some really intriguing parallels with what we find here in John 5. If we look at Mark chapter 2, verses 1 to 12, in that passage as well we have a healing of a paralysed man, perhaps a bit like the man of John 5. But in this case we have a man who was helped by his friends in order to reach Jesus before being told to take up his mat and walk. And that phrase, take up your mat and walk, is also there in our John reading. So it's fascinating to compare and contrast the two stories. So John sets out in verses 1 to 2 the geographical setting that we're dealing with. Jesus had gone to Jerusalem for an unnamed festival, but probably one of the 3 pilgrim festivals, though one imagines not Passover, as we heard about that in chapter 2. And he had come to this out-of-the-way pool with the 5 porticos around it. And verse 3 tells us that there were people who waited there who were blind or lame or paralysed, looking for healing and restoration. Now, some Bibles skip from verse 3 straight to verse 5. They miss out verse 4. And that's because verse 4 is not present in many early manuscripts. But those that have it give us effectively an explanation of what was going on here. The missing verse, as it were, verse 4, tells us that people believed that an angel of the Lord would appear and stir up the waters of this pool, and that the first person to enter the water after that had happened would receive healing. So it's maybe a later addition to the text, but it gives us a bit more context as to what's going on, and it makes sense of the man's response to Jesus. Now, we don't know how old this man was, and therefore we don't know what proportion of his life he'd spent being unwell. But at 38 years, as we read in verse 5, we can surmise that it was a substantial chunk of his life. And perhaps there was something about the longevity of his illness that explains his reticence when approached by Jesus. Perhaps he'd just become used to, oh, well, this is the way it is, it's never going to get any better, which is a very human reaction to prolonged hardship. We know that Jesus saw him lying there. We don't know why Jesus picked him out instead of anybody else lying around that pool. And somehow, though we're not told how, Jesus knew that he had been there for a long time, as we learn in the first part of verse 6. In the latter part of verse 6, we get the key question around which this whole episode hinges. Jesus asks the man, "Do you want to be made well?" Now, in today's context, we might well say there's something really significant here about how Jesus seeks consent from this man in order to act. He doesn't just take it upon himself to kind of come along and go zap. A, Jesus isn't a magician, but B, also, Jesus respects this man's bodily autonomy and his wishes and ability to give consent. So I say, as a modern reader of the text, the sense of that question, do you want to be made well? It's really important. But of course, there are other dimensions to that question as well. And you might well have expected a guy who'd been ill for 38 years, given this chance to be made well, would have bitten Jesus' hand off to gain that. But he doesn't. Instead, he complains that there was nobody to help him into the pool. And there's a real contrast there with Mark chapter 2, verse 4, because in that episode where a paralysed man is healed, it's really the faith of the friends that enables it to happen, and they make a hole in the roof of the house where Jesus is and lower their friend down. So determined are they to get him to Jesus. Whereas in this case, the man is saying, I've got nobody to help me. Nobody is willing to do that. So other people beat him to be the first one into the pool whenever the waters stirred. But Jesus doesn't indulge this self-pity or question or get into an argument about any healing powers the waters may have been perceived to have. Instead, as we see in verse 8, he tells the man to take up his mat and walk, which is the same thing that Jesus says in Mark 2 verse 11. Though in this instance, Mark's instance, it's after the Pharisees have been grumbling about what they've seen Jesus do. Just as with Mark chapter 2 verse 12, the man in this story was made well at once, and as we learn in verse 9, he dutifully took up his mat and walked away. We learn in verse 13 that after doing that, Jesus had sort of melted away into the crowd. But we note from the end of verse 9, as I've already pointed out, it was the Sabbath day. And that goes a long way to explain the controversy that we find if we read on a little bit into verses 10 through to 18. And indeed, it may be interesting if you're preparing worship on this particular passage to actually go on to tell the story of what happens in verses 10 to 18. Now, there's an awful lot one might say about this passage, but one thing it definitely does is offer a powerful counter to the claim that's sometimes made that God's ability to work with us and to heal and to bring about change in our lives is somehow a function of our level of faith, so that if somebody is not healed, they don't have enough faith. I've heard that kind of rhetoric used very harmfully and damagingly in the past. This story blows it out of the water in that the man that Jesus singled out of everybody there around that pool near the sheep gate was not a faithful person. He didn't even bother to learn Jesus' name, as we find out if we read on. And at the first opportunity, he puts the blame for his breaking of the Sabbath rules onto Jesus. And he tells the Jerusalem authorities who it was that healed him. So then that leads to Jesus beginning to be persecuted. That's the sense of verses 11 through to 15. Now, the sin that the man is reproached for by Jesus, if we read on a little bit, is fundamentally about this lack of trust, this lack of belief in Jesus as the Word made flesh. It's not, as we see very clearly if we look at the controversy of John chapter 9, suggesting that the man had been paralysed because of some sin that he'd previously committed. Jesus blows out of the water, that phrase again, the connection that's sometimes been made between disability and unconfessed sin. He highlights how that is a nonsense as well. I guess the bottom line here is that Jesus, having sought out possibly the worst choice of person to heal, is a God who is not limiting compassion to those who are deserving of it, in inverted commas. He heals simply because, as we see in verse 17 of this chapter, it's the work of his Father to bring the abundant life that Jesus tells us he comes to bring in John chapter 10 verse 10 to whomsoever he wishes. And that's clearly there in verses 19 and 21, reading that little bit further. So effectively what we have in today's reading is the beginning of a wider story that tells us a lot about the compassion and grace of God, the undeserved nature of God's grace and God's healing and willingness to work with us. Say there's an interesting contrast to be made with the story of Mark, and a lot to think about in that key question: do you want to be made well? So with all that in mind, we now turn to our questions for this week.